Morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. You're most welcome to this series of seminars. We are actually promoting an understanding of the intersection between violence against children and violence against women. This series of events and webinars are brought to you and convened by this institute, the Children's Institute at the University of Cape Town, the Gender and Health Research Unit, Sonke Gender Justice Center, and today we are proudly joined by Raising Voices as a partner for this series. But finally, I want to introduce the Africa Partnership to End Violence Against Children. As you may all be aware, or some of you have been aware, the series started on the 15th of September and they're running through to 13th of October. The first series was on understanding the intersection between violence against children and violence against women. The second one on the 22nd of September was global frameworks and how does inspire, respect, and support an intersectional approach. Today we are now going to ask the question and answer the question, what are we learning about the interventions in Africa to jointly address violence against children and violence against women? I have very renowned speakers, researchers, and practitioners that will be speaking to us, two eminent ladies that will sharing their perspectives with us. But before I introduce them to you, I just want to run us through a quick question. A question was put out to us. I do not know whether you were able to see the question. Do the global frameworks work across all contexts? Why do you think so? Be kind to go to the chat room and drop in any message, your response, what you think, what your perspectives are, because we'd want to hear from you. Many a time these global frameworks are put out there, but it's only you who is on ground and interacting with them on a day-to-day basis that can tell us how they are operating, on how what the challenges are in the implementation. So thank you very much. I'll just give you 2 minutes to drop your messages there, and then I'll immediately to giving some in-house or housekeeping announcements on how we are going to operate. 2 minutes and then we move on. All right, I see that I have both my presenters on. Just to guide our discussion this afternoon, I'm just going to have the housekeeping rules. One is that we will have 2 panelists and each one of them is going to speak for 20 minutes. We'll have 20 minutes for each presentation, 15 minutes for the presentation, and then we'll have 2 to 5 minutes for questions and answers from you. But again, feel free to use the chat room to drop in information or questions that you may have that will come in. Please note that this session is going to be recorded, and therefore we seek your indulgence to have it recorded for our record and proceedings. But in the event that you feel uncomfortable about the recording, please do let us know by dropping a message in the chat box as well. But otherwise, we would want to have records of these proceedings so that we could share them with you. We would also want to hear your comments and questions in the Q&A as the sessions and the presentations are going on. Some of you may have heard about the key issues that we are going to talk about, and you have questions that have been pending in your mind. Please feel free to drop in. We will also be running a few polls relating to the topic. What are we learning? Please feel free to share that, to drop in a question, to drop in your opinion in the polls that will be running. And then want to encourage you to please engage effectively and actively in our social media platforms, hashtag Fathers Matter ZA, or Twitter, on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram. You can also use hashtag Hotline ZA. And then you can also use the Core Human and then NRIF News. All these are going to be live and we are feeding with you live. Thank you so much. I will now move to what and to give an overview of who we are and what we do as the Africa Partnership. As you have already heard, this event is co-hosted and convened by Children's Institute, the University of Cape Town, and Sonka Gender Center, and the Africa to End Violence Against Children, with Raising Voices joining us on this segment as a partner. I'll now share with you my screen. Just quickly to give you an overview of what the Africa Partnership is all about. We are all familiar with the Global Partnership to End Violence Against Children. The Africa Partnership is the African arm of the Global Partnership to End Violence Against Children, and it is a platform that was established to promote an Africa-wide movement and conversation around preventing and responding to violence against children. So the series of webinars that we are having is basically responding to the reason why this partnership was informed. It is a multi-sectoral platform that brings together governments, UN agencies, international organizations, faith-based organizations, private sector, philanthropic foundations, researchers, academia, and children themselves around the agenda to end violence against children. What motivated this partnership was basically one, that when the Agenda 16.2 was passed, as a framework to end violence against children, we realized that there was a lot of complications and struggles with governments and civil society to appreciate, to prevent and respond to violence against children. The second reason that the partnership was created was to ensure that the efforts to address violence against children do not only focus on response, but also begin to look at the agenda of preventing violence before it happens. So prevention science then became one of the underlying reasons why the partnership was formed. The third one was because there were fragmented efforts across sectors, and there was no unifying platform that would bring all actors together on the continent. And so the Africa Partnership was formed to do the three, but above all, to ensure that all the emerging global developments that require regular monitoring were being monitored, and that we could actually send information back to the AU or back to the UN on what was happening in Africa. So that was why the Africa Partnership was formed. So quickly, we have 5 distinct competences. One, the partnership has a continental reach, and the continental reach is already demonstrated by all of you who are participating here, that we cut across from North Africa to South Africa, East Africa to West Africa, and we have presence in the government, civil society, the academia, and the second one is the convening power. Again, together with the Children's Institute, this is a demonstration of what distinctive competence we have. The third one is the expertise on violence against children. We will very shortly be bringing on board experts who will share with you the expertise, because it is this partnership that brings even knowledgeable expertise to share with you. And then the one thing that we also are good at is to bring the African voice. And I'm glad that you've all been able to join in this conversation where we are answering the questions, what are we learning? And I'm glad that we will all be moving this journey together until the 13th of October. And then the other one, which is really what is demonstrated across the continent, is the strong collaboration with partners, from the AU organs to the regional economic committees, to the academia, to the private sector, to civil society organizations, to governments. The list is endless. African Partnership to End Violence Against Children depends largely on evidence and knowledge. And today we are here to share that evidence and knowledge. But before we share the evidence and knowledge, just to give you a quick highlight on what our priorities are. One is that the partnership exists to build political will for action at a Pan-African level. Now, the question may be, why do we need the political will? It is because actions to end violence against children and women more than ever before requires an engagement at a higher level. That while as practitioners, as researchers will generate the evidence, we need to get the movers who will then put the resources, who will then cause the conversations to change at Pan-African and also national level. The second one is also to promote cross-country learning. With this platform and series of seminars, it is already demonstrated that a lot of learning is going on. Please drop into the chat room and let us know what you're learning, how you're learning, and now we can move from there. Then the third one, which is what I have already talked about, is promoting accountability, monitoring, and reporting on progress. It's no point having beautiful international instruments up there without us having a system of monitoring and being accountable. So broadly, that is what the partnership is about. To the question that are being answered, what is the intersection between violence against children and violence against women? I just want to give us a quick sneak peek into what to expect. The speakers will be telling us more about what works, what doesn't work, and what we are learning. But quickly, I think there is already a growing recognition about the realities that violence against women and violence against children are a public health and human rights concern that must be addressed. And this is found in reports and documents of WHO, UNICEF country reports that show that. The second one that I want to highlight is, over the years, there's been a historical kind of like acceptance that researchers, programs, and policies on violence against children have known to follow parallel sides. That there's one, on the one side, if you interact with violence against children, you very barely get to know what is happening in violence against women. And now we have the opportunity to bring the intersection between the two. It also goes to funding streams. You can also see from the funding streams, you'll have specific calls for proposals that are focusing on violence against children or exclusively violence against women. You have lead agencies that will specifically just be looking at violence against women, against children. You'll have terminologies that will just describe that. But what we are saying today is that researchers are pushing for a need to bridge the divide. That while we have for a long time held this position, there is need to bridge the divide, and because evidence shows that addressing violence against children on its own will not give us the results that we desire. Secondly, that it also will limit us because once we begin looking at the intersections, then probably together we can actually begin looking at how we can move towards achieving joint results. But above all, when we are looking at the intersection, I think we need to begin reflecting on how the deliberate link between violence against children and violence against women will help us as practitioners, as governments, as partnerships to achieve the desired results, but above all, to move towards the realization of Agenda 2020. Allow me now invite one of my speakers. One of the speakers that I'm about to introduce to you is a renowned scholar. She is the Professor Shanaaz Mathews, the director of the Children's Institute in University of Cape Town. Shanaaz of accumulated experience that spans all over 30 years. From being a researcher to a practitioner to a technical advisor to a subject matter specialist, not only to civil society, but also not only to the university and the academia, but also to governments. Her research career spans over 2 decades, and the specialty of her research has been on violence against women and violence against children. So what an honor to have Shanaaz, because in her recent research on violence against women and violence against children, she specifically narrowed down and honed in on understanding how childhood adversities shape men's violence towards intimate partners and service response to the core victimization of mothers and children. So Shanaaz will share with us her perspective, and she'll be speaking to us from where she sits, her research background, her experience in working on violence against children and violence against women. And it's now my honor to invite Shanaaz to deliver her presentation. What is working? Thank you. Shanaaz, over to you.
You're muted.
Shanaaz, you're muted. Shanaaz, you're muted, please. Thank you.
Okay. Am I unmuted now?
You are.
Thank you, Stella, for the warm welcome, and thank you for the guests who have joined us this afternoon. And I've got to share my screen, and I'm not able to do that. Okay. There you go. Okay, thank you. And as Stella indicated, I'm going to be talking about what we have learned about joint programming to prevent violence against women and violence against children in Africa. And I want to start off by acknowledging the team that have been working with me on this review, particularly Ghebrebrhan Makola, who was one of the speakers in Seminar 1, as well as Veda Megnon, who was our research or is our research assistant on this particular project. I want to start off and just continuing on the note that Stella started this today. I mean, Stella has acknowledged the fact that violence against women and violence against children are both public health problems as well as human rights problems that affects large numbers of children and women across the globe. The estimates that we have shows us that over half of the child population across the world, or over 1 billion children, have experienced violence in the past year. Similarly, 1 in 3 women have experienced intimate partner violence. What this tells us is that large parts of society have experienced some form of violence. But most importantly, and what really is critical for us to understand, is when we start looking at the pattern of violence, the No Violence study of 2017 shows us very clearly that children on the continent of Africa are most heavily affected by violence. So when you start looking at where violence occurs, Africa, certainly for both women and children, is a continent where the numbers are highest. And I think that's really, really important for us to acknowledge this and to recognize that it is imperative for us to start thinking about how we deliver joint programming in order to firstly reduce the impact of violence, and secondly to start thinking about how we can prevent violence from occurring. So as Stella had indicated, and the first 2 sessions of the seminar series very clearly outlines how violence against women and violence against children have developed as very distinct fields, yet we know they co-occur within the same household, share common risk factors, as well have severe intergenerational consequences. And based on this, we start acknowledging that one drives the other, and we've got to be thinking about how we stop the cycle of violence. I'm wanting to just quickly reflect on our overarching review that we have been doing, and to acknowledge that what we are doing is to, and Ghebrebrhan presented some of our review in the first Seminar 1, and just to highlight very quickly that what we have done is to use an intersectional feminist framework to underpin our work and our understanding of both violence against women and children. And what I mean by this is that we have to take into account that certain characteristics give some people power over others. And particularly if we start looking at violence in the household, we see that it occurs and affects both women and children, particularly where there are social norms that drive this form of violence, like patriarchy, and where male power is predicated on the subordination of both women and children within the family. Secondly, our work has also been guided by the framework developed by Alessandra Guedes in 2016, and quite seminal work in getting us to understand the relationship between violence against women and violence against children, that they not only are driven by the same social norms that underpin violence against women and children, but that they often have shared and they have common risk factors as well that co-occur in the same household with very similar intergenerational effects and consequences, with adolescents coming out as the period most at risk. So when we're thinking of reviewing interventions to reduce violence against women and children, I want to a disclaimer that it is really a growing area, particularly in the global south. There is a growing body of evidence of interventions, but there are very few of these interventions that have looked at jointly reducing both violence against women and violence against children. So in the programs that we've looked at, ideally, and if for a program to be effective, it has to be reducing both violence against women as well as violence against children. But because of it being an emerging area of work, we also started looking at promising interventions, and we considered a promising intervention if it had an effect on either reduction of violence against children or violence against women, as well as being effective in reducing a key risk factor that underpins both violence against women and children. We only included interventions with evidence bases from research, so we wanted to know that there was a solid evidence base that we could draw on, and studies were looked at in terms of their designs as well for trustworthiness, so we could trust the evidence that was being published. I think in our understanding of violence prevention, I want to highlight the socio-ecological model because it's really important for us to understand that violence isn't just a random act, that there are factors and it's underpinned by, so we don't understand why one household and not another experiences violence well enough. But what we do know that there are certain factors at play, and violence, there's a web of interrelated factors that increases risk for someone to experience violence. And there is an interrelationship between the individual, their relationships within the family, as well as community, that then plays out in order for violence to occur within a household and community. Stella alluded to the fact that last week we looked at frameworks for preventing violence against women and children, and I'm just wanting to highlight this once again, that globally we have got Inspire and Respect as frameworks to end both violence against women, to work towards ending violence against women and violence against children. I want to raise a really important issue that we have to also look at the evidence base that this is drawn from. So when we look at the evidence base that these strategies are drawn from, we see that a large number of these studies are emerging from high-income countries, while some has emerged from low and middle-income countries, and in particular Africa. Most of these studies have been rigorously evaluated through RCTs, but not many have been implemented and taken to scale. And therefore, I do want to highlight the fact that I feel, and it is my take on this, is that we require further investigation to establish what really works in contexts like Africa, to ensure that we also can be quite clear that although these frameworks are there to guide us, but to actually develop an evidence base that shows what works in our particular context. So the review that we conducted, and here I'm wanting to start off by saying that there are huge caveats here, that although what we have done is to group interventions into promising strategies, but that often they're not as discreet as I'm making them out to be, and we can have a long debate whether in fact, we have grouped them appropriately. I want to also start off by saying that there is no silver bullet, and what I'm presenting this afternoon is rather promising interventions rather than, effective interventions that we can, we want to back completely. And so what I'm wanting to raise are certain questions this afternoon and to leave you with a number of thoughts rather than come out and saying that definitively that these are the best ways to reduce violence against women and violence against children. And I think what I would like to start off saying also is that very few of these interventions have been implemented with the provision to explore both the reduction of violence against women and children, and rather it had been implemented with the idea of either targeting violence against women or violence against children. And therefore I see this very much as an emerging field, and the work that we're presenting today is somewhat of a, background work for us to start thinking about how we strengthen our work on the continent in this area. So I want to start off by talking about changing social norms, and this is probably the one area we know quite a bit about. And when we start thinking about changing social norms, community mobilization and activism approaches are certainly ones that stand out, and here the work by Raising Voices such as SASA has been leading us in our thinking around what interventions are promising and effective in reducing both violence against women and children. And in fact, Natsnet will be talking about SASA after I complete my presentation now. So when we think about community mobilizations, we see that it has the ability to change community attitudes, norms, behaviors around gender and violence. And it also simultaneously starts addressing the power imbalances between women and men and shift underlying gender inequalities. And this community activism is certainly central component to these programs. And I think what we are learning and what we have learned particularly over the past few years about implementing interventions on changing social norms is that once, and this was shown in an adaptation that was done of SASA in Rwanda, where the program didn't have the same effects that SASA had for reducing violence against women and violence against children in Rwanda. And one of the main reasons for this being is that one has to be really careful around adaptation of programs, that when you think about adapting a program, you've got to think about your context as well. And often core components like community activism doesn't translate in the same way that maybe in Uganda it works. So one has to think very carefully about program adaptation. I think really critically with changing social norms, the focus is also on transforming ideas on masculinity. And this is really key if we're wanting to reduce both intimate partner violence in the home as well as violence against children. What certainly is promising is that we are seeing other interventions on the continent. So for instance, an intervention from Ghana showing promise to reduce intimate partner violence. It hasn't shown the same effect with reducing violence against children, although it had a component of that in the program. So one would have to start thinking about what do you need to be focusing on and learning from what is working in order to be strengthening current approaches. The second area, and I think, as I've said, the caveat here is that they don't all neatly fit well into just these themes. But when you start thinking about reducing violence against children, certainly strengthening child protection and strengthening families is a key and should be a key strategy. Targeting, risk factors that increases the risk for violence both against women and children is really important. And we see this in a program from Zambia that looked at targeting poor mental health outcomes as well as alcohol abuse. And this was really a mental health intervention where task shifting was used as an approach to use community lay workers to enable them to work with both families, adult members of families and children in families. So at a family level, the intervention hoped to reduce conflict in the family and also think about reducing childhood trauma to reduce intergenerational transmission of trauma. However, what we did find, what the outcome of this intervention was that it didn't reduce childhood trauma, although it did reduce intimate partner violence. And the idea around reducing childhood trauma means that you can reduce the potential for later victimization and perpetration. And therefore, it's certainly critical to start looking at why interventions are not working fully as one would want them to, and start thinking about what are the ways that you could be strengthening them. And I think this is really important because a lesson that we are learning from Burkina Faso, where they've introduced what is called the trickle-up approach, where they've combined economic and family strengthening approaches to reduce harsh discipline and intimate partner violence. And it has been shown to be successful in a small-scale study, and it requires more evidence to tell us whether in fact this can work at a larger scale. But what this is telling us is that working with both women, men, and getting them to understand rights of children is certainly an important strategy in thinking about joint programming. A third way of thinking and third area of interventions are focused on improving parenting practices. And this area, I think, has been around for a long time, and there's been a great evidence base around parenting practices and parenting practice to improve outcomes in parenting. But it's quite new to be thinking about parenting practices to reduce both violence against women and violence against children. The promising strategy is that it can improve family dynamics to prevent violence against children. However, very few parenting interventions have evaluated whether in fact they can prevent both violence against women and violence against children. There's an opportunity to include concepts of gender equity and non-violent forms of discipline in the home in these programs. And it is really critical that we start thinking about moving beyond just parenting skills focus, but integrating gender norms and building gender norms and equity into the programs. What we are seeing from a promising intervention from Uganda that's called the REAL program, where they've included fathers in the parenting program, that certainly it has shown effect in non-violent discipline outcomes, both towards the child as well as a reduction of using intimate partner violence. So I do think it is really critical that we start thinking about these pockets of where we're seeing really important outcomes and how we can be using some of those lessons in other programs. One of the areas that have also been looked at and worked in for a long time is school-based violence, school-based programs, but not really with thinking about reduction of both violence against women and violence against children. We know that adolescence, particularly adolescence, is a period of risk, but I think it's important for us to start conceptualizing risk from even before adolescence. So the pre-adolescent period is just as an important period to be targeting. And it's a high risk time for both victimization and perpetration. And we see the emergence of violence against women starting to emerge during the adolescent period. And therefore, what is critical is that what we're seeing working is that multifaceted or multi-component interventions can reduce dating violence and sexual violence amongst learners, where interventions are targeting both educators as well as parents. And I think this is really critical, because what we're wanting to see is a whole schools approach rather than just targeting learners, where everyone and should be including parents as well. One of the programs that have recently been evaluated in Kenya focused on Empower, a self-defense training combining building of self-esteem for young girls and challenging ideas of masculinity and use of violence amongst young boys. And the idea is to strengthen protective factors to reduce experiences of violence. Unfortunately, this program wasn't as successful as we would want it to be in terms to reduce the rate of sexual assault amongst adolescent girls. It had limitations, and similarly a program evaluated in South Africa also had limitations in its outcome to reduce sexual assault, a school-based program, and therefore one has to start thinking about how we strengthen our school-based programs by allowing it to have multiple delivery strategies. An area that had been spoken about quite a bit on the continent is economic strengthening. However, economic strengthening interventions targeting both women and girls, although it's been shown as promising to reduce both violence against women and children in both Inspire and the Respect strategies, empirical evidence to support this have been critiqued. And why it's been critiqued is because it's very, what the critique is highlighting is that the causal relationship between economic strengthening and the reduction in violence lacks the necessary rigorous evidence. What they are meaning by this is that that the current evidence base we're having isn't showing clearly that it is the intervention itself that's causing the reduction in their violent outcomes. And therefore combining economic strengthening with gender transformative strategies, improve it, and parenting practices to reduce both VAC and VAW requires further research, and in fact it does require us to apply our minds to consider how we might be combining these strategies. I want to talk a bit about thinking about our evidence base and the research that we've been conducting, because what we have seen and is that there's been a plethora of research and evidence showing us what can work to end violence against women and other studies on violence against children. But the gap between the research and implementation is certainly have not been breached, because what we are seeing is that the research, and particularly the RCTs that's providing us with a gold standard around what the interventions should be. Researchers develop partnerships with NGOs to implement interventions, but researchers leave once this research papers have been written up, and implementing partners do not have the necessary resources to continue implementation of programs at the same level that it had been done during research. And policymakers often don't see the importance of funding programs and taking programs to scale. So there is quite a lot of work that needs to be done, not only to show what works, but then to start thinking about how do we take programs to scale when they do work. What I have learned over the years is that it's not just about the intervention, but that implementation matters, and how we think about implementation and the time we invest in implementation is certainly critical to for the benefit of outcomes. So what we do know is that if programs are not consistently implemented and your training isn't happening at the same level that it happened while you were doing an RCT, that in effect we will not have the same outcomes as the Gold Star RCT had, and therefore it's really important that we give attention to implementation. What are in conclusion, the main lessons that we have learned is that multiple component interventions certainly have a better success in achieving improved and sustained outcomes. We also have seen that adolescence is possibly an important period to target these complex pathways and intersecting risks associated with both violence against women and violence against children. We also know that interventions need to consider multiple incidents of violence across the life course, and therefore interventions cannot just be solely focused on one aspect of violence. Community-based interventions combining gender equitable norms, parenting or family strengthening interventions are important and shows potential to reduce intergenerational effects of violence and reducing the long-term outcomes. But what works is just the starting point. As I've told you, implementation matters for programs to be taken to scale. And I think it's really, really important that we have to consider this as we're thinking about joint programming for the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that illuminating presentation. Shanaaz, you have not only given us the evidence base, but you have also given us examples of promising practices across the continent. But the question that you put to us and what we need to get to carry away is beyond everything else, whatever we do in terms of our studies, implementation matters. So I want to pose this question again, go to our chat room. Does our continent need to develop its own interventions? Why do you say so? Please get to the chat room, drop your messages there, drop your perspectives there, because we want to hear from you. As I mentioned in the beginning, it's an interactive session and we would really love to hear what you think. Do we, and I want to add in Africa, need to develop our own interventions? And if you say so, why do you say so? I just want to bring in a little, when Shanaaz was talking about lesson learned and that just the question, what works is just the beginning, I was reminded about an experience that I had in Uganda where a national helpline for children was working so well, and then there was a proposal to bring on board and merge it with a women's GBV line. I was the first person to oppose it vehemently, and my reason was children will get lost. How will we have this done? But now from your exposition, as I think I'm having second thoughts, I need to go back onto my word and tell the people that I opposed vehemently that I am so sorry, it wasn't what I meant to say. But we'll get to the practical area of this. I would like to invite my next speaker. And at this point, allow me to introduce to you a practitioner, a very seasoned implementer, a person who has served a career from working in humanitarian interventions and having a grounding on humanitarian setting to actually practical work that she now does at Raising Voices. Natsnet Ghebrebrhan is the current coordinator at Raising Voices in Kampala, Uganda. She has been supporting a dynamic team within Raising Voices and also participates in other leadership programs. But above all, she brings to this conversation 19 years of well-grounded experience in designing and implementing approaches to address violence against women, specifically in humanitarian setting. But also what she's going to share with us is the practice, what has worked. And she's going to talk a little bit more about the practical. How has SASA, for example, worked? What are the lessons that we draw from SASA? So when we come from the from the research side, we've drawn from the evidence, we've seen the promising practices. Here is a promising practice that is working. How has it been taken to scale? So Natsnet, please take the floor.
Thank you, Stella, for that beautiful introduction. And I'm very happy to be part of this conversation and contribute a bit around the big question we have across the field of violence prevention by sharing what Raising Voices is doing and what we are learning. For this specific presentation, I'm going to share a bit of our experience and learning on how SASA approach has contributed to the reduction of children's exposure to violence, and I will try to share what SASA is and then go into the details of the learning. So just to give you a bit of background around who we are and what we do, Raising Voices has been working on both programs, violence against women and violence against children prevention for the last 20 years. And we have adopted learning and commitment to learning across our programs. And in 2015, we carried out a study to understand the intersections of VAW and VAC, because these two issues are primarily our focus of our work. And we were able to learn around like how both issues occur, how they manifest, and then what are some of the structural enablers of those in family setting. So we have done a learning paper, and this graphic summarizes what we have learned, like around the manifestation and the occurrence, and then some of the norms at the family level, and then how the family is structured, becoming the kind of the things that are holding those practices at household levels. And then we have also done a secondary data review of the SASA RCT to understand the impact of the intervention on children, and which I will focus my presentation on. So just before we move very far, we would like to take a bit of time to understand what SASA is. It is a community mobilization approach to prevent violence against women by supporting social norm change. And it was piloted in Kampala between 2008 and 2012 and has proved to be effective in preventing violence against women, and then also impacting violence experience of children on violence, witnessing violence. So I'm going to invite the tech team to show us a short video that introduces SASA. Tech team, over to you.
Many people say violence against women is part of everyday life. Change will take generations. With SASA, change happens now. SASA is used throughout Africa and beyond to prevent violence against women and HIV. It is a phased process that becomes part of a community and changes that community from within. Here's how it works. An organization trains a group of community members who want to become community activists. They are women, men, mothers, fathers, doctors, clergy, police officers, hairstylists, market vendors, and more, who all believe in a non-violent future. These community activists become the voices of SASA. Through SASA, they discover the power within themselves to lead change in their community. Through SASA, they're equipped with the skills and tools to do so. First, the community activists break the silence. They get people talking about men's power over women and how it hurts everyone. They work in everyday spaces and welcome every thought and emotion until together women and men see the benefits of change. As their work continues, the people they reach start raising the issue with others. As people start thinking about alternatives to violence, community activists help them find support and provide support. They remind people of the strength that comes from joining one's power with another's. They bring people together, both women and men, to support them in gathering the courage to live differently. People start connecting and recognizing each other with the understanding that they are in this together. Over time and with support, people gain the power to take action. Many people in many places start doing something to create change. Institutions start working differently to prevent and respond to violence against women. Everyone is watching and learning from couples who are balancing their power and enjoying the benefits. An unstoppable change is in motion. So what makes SASA effective? SASA follows a commonly recognized process of change, experienced in all areas of our lives. At the start, people accept an issue as normal. Then gradually, they gain awareness of the problem. With awareness, they seek support to make change. With support, they find the courage to take action. SASA influences social norm change at all levels. It sparks change in individuals, in their relationships with family and friends, in community institutions, and in the media, policies, and leadership shaping society. SASA ideas become part of community life through a blend of 4 strategies: local activism, media and advocacy, communication materials, and training. SASA makes violence personal by using the language of power. The power within ourselves means power over women, joining power with one another, and having the power to take action. This is community mobilization. This is SASA. Use it to do something powerful.
Great. Thank you, team. I'm trying to reshare my slide. Can you see it?
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you. So SASA is having a life of its own. What we have seen is like SASA, the first edition, but Raising Voices is really deliberate around bringing the lessons and integrating it into the guide and then the kit. So after the first edition, we were able to adapt SASA to using it in faith-based communities. It could be Christian community or Muslim community, and to prevent violence against women. And now we call that a version SASA Faith. And this year, in February, we have also launched SASA Together, that is kind of incorporating the decade-long experience and learning of using SASA across the globe in different types of settings. And this doesn't really include the variations of SASA adaptations that are being led by partners and various organizations. So talking about the study, the RCT has really shown promising or effective results that there could be a big change within a project life, which is like 3 years programming to creating the change we really desire. It has really uplifted our spirit around like change is confirming that change is possible. So SASA has showed a reduction of women's risk of violence, of intimate partner violence, physical violence by 52%. The primary outcomes of the RCT focused mainly on VAW, but there was another exercise like secondary data analysis of both quantitative and qualitative to see how it is affecting or influencing children's experience. And we were very also uplifted or inspired by what emerged from that learning. So in the follow-up, when women said that they are experiencing less violence and then physical violence in the last year as like the main outcome, we have also seen that women who didn't report like a reduction, they said that, or even if it is happening, it's happening when children are not around. And we have also got the estimate based on the researchers' estimate, the reduction of children's exposure to IPV in those communities was estimated to be 64%. And then overall, the data has also shown that there is a reduction in family disruption because prior to the intervention, women would go away and then because they were trying to avoid violence in their homestead or on their families. As in one of the quotes that we found was, "My children are free. They are living with their mother because it was not for SASA. I would not move on. I would have gone away." So it has been really, communities are really appreciating what is also coming out of SASA and influencing the life and experience of children. The abstracts indicate that the research is not statistically significant, but for those who are really keen in terms of digging deep and then understanding the findings, I recommend that you go and read the SASA study, Child Abuse and Neglect in 2015, to get more insight of the learning and the data, the findings. So there was also like an exploration of like what kind of themes are emerging from the secondary data analysis. We were able to see SASA has impacted on parenting. Parents reported that the quality of relationship, the communication with their children, the way they are connecting, the way they are spending time has really improved and it's shifting to be nurturing and very productive. And then there were also evidence that suggests parents are reflecting on how their words and actions impact their children because of what they are receiving as an idea, how they're engaging about this SASA idea. They're taking it into different aspects of their life and then really questioning the existing assumptions, beliefs, and practices. And similarly, in this case, they are also really taking those new idea in how they are relating to children. And some parents are also involving their children in decision making. This is mainly around issues that concern children themselves, like, for example, studying or schooling and so on. So there is quite a positive shift on quality of parenting. One of the male community members had said, before I joined SASA, my children were afraid of me. My children would never hold a conversation with me. But from the time I joined SASA, I converse with them. They are free with me. They even tell me their problems. They even correct me when they feel I'm not right. They no longer fear me. They tell me that their problem, and I also tell them why I'm not able to give them what they need. Before they used to think that I deliberately refuse to meet their needs. So this quote really elaborates how the parent-child relationship is evolving to a better or quality relationship. So the second theme that emerged is around corporal punishment, where in most cases or previously, corporal punishment was perceived as a way of disciplining. Some parents say that we are no longer using physical punishment or corporal punishment with children, but some say like we are still using it, but we use it just as a last resort. We would explore other ways. We would advise, we would listen, we would inform, but we would just use it if there is no change. And the last one is also around encouraging critical thinking, similar to what I have shared, around how corporal punishment could really impact children. Like a mother said in one instance that, okay, if I don't really like to be beaten, how about my child? So it's really helping people to think in different ways. A quote from a community member, a female community member, according to what my children have gone through and how their father would beat them before we separated, I cannot punish my children. I treat them carefully so they can heal from the trauma they have experienced. I do not want them to say that I also mistreat them after going through a lot. I want to be friend with my children. Before SASA, I would beat them. So it has really impacted the style of parenting, the style of disciplining within the family setting. And the last one is the effect of SASA on how, especially with the spirit of activism that is promoted within SASA, now community members have really embraced that, like they could really speak out when they see something. They can also do something when that speaking is not really bringing results. So, for example, they say that they would report to a police, they would report to the LC, they would do really something to ensure the violence or mistreatment of children doesn't really continue on such settings. So another quote that I would like to share, those sessions have helped me. You find that in slum areas like this, many people make mistakes at home and they do it unknowingly. So for us, how have those been sessions, like especially SASA's activities? We are like attorneys for such children, or we are like watchmen for abused people in the community. On many occasions, I have confronted parents and rebuked their actions. So people are really feeling confident to speak up when they see something bad happening or violence happening in many aspects. It could be violence against women, violence against children, and broadly any violence against anyone. So finally, we feel like as a field, as an organization, we are really seeing the commonality or the intersections of violence against women and violence against children. And we have also seen some interventions like SASA are having impact on children's life and their experience of witnessing violence against women. But the question is, I think this is what has been really mentioned by Shanaaz and Stella. Can we have like a program that really integrates both and then maintain the same level of focus, and it remains to be effective, it remains to be ethical? But what we know for sure is, I think programs that are trying to address the intersectionality of both issues should really, really maintain feminist framing, feminist informed decision for the program. Because as Stella mentioned, like, oh, okay, if we bring these two issues together, like who is going to get the limelight, or like who is going to be sidelined? So I think that is quite a tricky question that we have to put our heads experiences together and then pave the way forward for the field. So thank you so much. I'm going to hand the mic back to Stella. But if there is any comment or question, I am happy to address and respond.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Natsnet. There wouldn't have been a better grounding for us to move from evidence and research to what is actually working. Thank you so very much. And thank you too to the participants for actively engaging. We have some very interesting questions, and I just want to run them by the presenters. I just want to start with Shanaaz. Shanaaz, one question that has come for you is that how, in your opinion, do you see the strategy for strengthening families align or not align with intersectional feminist framework underpinning the research? That is one. Your second question is, did you take account of Ubuntu philosophy in your research? If so, how, and if not, why not? Then your third question, Shanaaz, is that should we not work more intensely with mothers and women on the breaking down of stereotypes? It is mothers who are reinforcing these gendered roles and perpetuating the culture of dominance in males. So those are the three questions that are there for you. And for Natsnet, the 3 questions that have emerged for you. Thank you so much, dear participants. One of them is a number of religious and cultural practices have been seen to promote violence against children and violence against women. Do you think some of these practices need a serious review? The second one is changing norms take time, changing practices take longer. Do we give enough time to researching programs? For example, school-based programming may have an impact on violence against women many years late. Norms are also multidimensional. Schools, faith, community, traditional leaders, and so on. Do we invest sufficiently enough as actors to tip the balance? Again, this could go either way. Shanaaz could also answer, because he talked a lot about tipping the balance, about the balancing act. And then finally for Natsnet is basically to tell us how can SASA curriculum and training be accessed? Quickly, I'd like to start with Shanaaz as Natsnet gets a breather. Shanaaz, over to you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the audience for the breadth of questions. So the intersectional feminist framework certainly in terms of family strengthening, and I think, you know, I'm wanting to put it out there that we're not talking about family strengthening in the traditional way of thinking mother, father, and your nuclear family. But when you start thinking about family strengthening, it's also about then dismantling the power inequalities that exist in family structures that perpetuate violence against women and children. And I think this is really, really critical in understanding why choosing a framework like this can move the field forward, because what you're wanting to do is to, it is about creating or reducing the power imbalances within relationships within the family, and that's what the intersectional feminist approach will allow you to understand, and it allows you to understand those dynamics. And therefore a family strengthening approach should also take into account how you diminish those power imbalances. So when you think about violence against children in households, it is also about children's lack of power and how children are perceived and not having a voice in those families. And therefore, I want to link that to one of the other questions that was asked about mothers and their role in perpetuating gender inequalities. I would disagree with just targeting mothers. I think it's really important to target families as a whole, because if you target only mothers, she lacks the power to make a substantial difference in her own experience. And 22 years ago, I worked on building a network on violence against women. And part of the work we did at that stage was to build capacity of women to understand gender and to understand how their experiences of violence are impacted by, and for them to understand the roles and gendered roles. Women came back and they understood that they had how violence was happening, but they could not change the violence because their partners were violent. And therefore, working just with mothers, you're not able to change the dynamic significantly to reduce her experiences of violence and in turn children's experiences of violence. And therefore, I am certainly wanting to stress that you've got to think about multi-component approaches where you can work with one member of the family, but you've got to bring in others as well. And it has to be that intersectional approach that can move the agenda forward. Natsnet, you're going to have to help me around Ubuntu, because certainly what my understanding of Ubuntu is and what someone else's understand, but my understanding of Ubuntu, particularly in Africa, is around everyone caring and collectively. Mm-hmm. And the difficulty is that how we've moved forward and how we as society have moved is that we've moved away from the village approach where everyone collectively takes responsibility for caring for children. In my approach of looking at interventions, and when I looked at it, there were none recorded that or documented that I could say is making a difference that adopted an Ubuntu approach. Natsnet, you might know of others, but certainly if there are Ubuntu approaches that the audience is feeling is making a difference, please communicate those. I'm all for looking at different approaches and what can potentially be homegrown and making a difference. As someone in the chat has said, you know, in Africa, there are cultural practices and other social norms that need to be taken into account. And I fully agree with that. And therefore, homegrown approaches are really, really important. Natsnet, over to you.
Great. Thank you, Shanaaz. Yeah, I also want to kind of reiterate your point around women's kind of understanding women's gender role. Like, why are women sometimes reinforcing some practices should really be interrogated, and it has to be analyzed using like against the patriarchal system that we have in most of our African settings. So it's really very hard to kind of just look at women and then what they are doing. We really have to understand the context, why they are doing it. Because sometimes if they fail to do that, there will be sort of sanction against them. So it becomes like a sort of survival acceptance for women to kind of abide by what is perceived like that, which is like really harmful. But it will not really work just by working on focusing on women. We really have to broaden our perspective and then aim at shifting the system and transforming the system broadly. Yeah, I think I don't really like that question or idea of Ubuntu. Really nice idea of like building our interventions based on the things that we know to work in our context. I feel like the technical term in violence prevention work for Ubuntu is the holistic engagement. Just like in your presentation, you were talking about how we have to really work through the ecological model and engage everyone to shift and bring change in our community or in our lives. So I feel like the concept and the idea of Ubuntu is being practiced or being considered in so many violence prevention programs, but maybe we have to reclaim the language and rename it as Ubuntu, but the holistic engagement sounds like that. The number of religion and cultural practices, I know it is quite complicated because religion being a sensitive subject, even like culture, and being practiced for several centuries, shifting it really requires a careful approach. In Sasa, for example, when Sasa faith was adapted for religious, like for faith community, it has taken the approach of building on what is working instead of going and then like kind of fighting those harmful verses. It really builds on the value of any faith that is being promoted, which are justice, peace, and dignity. So it's about building in and letting people recognize those hidden values and then putting those values into surface in a way or contributing to violence prevention. Because if you push and if you have like an aggressive approach, it could really trigger back and cause a lot of harm. But in Sasa and Sasa faith, it really brings out the values, the existing positive values. And the other approach that we also see in Sasa is questioning approach. You don't activists won't go and tell people you do this or you don't do that. It's about engaging people into a very reflective process so that they can really find what really resonates and what makes sense and what is not making sense. So those two approaches help somehow address the sensitivity around culture and religion. There was also a question or a point around the long-term nature of change. Any change, it doesn't really happen in overnight. It's quite a process, especially when it comes to shifting norms. In SASA, the programming, the 4 phases take between 3 to 4 years, but there is also a recognition that change is not linear. It is like quite zigzaggy, and there is also a tendency of relapsing to old ways of being, old ways of living. So that element of activism and nurturing people who are really passionate about this issue and will be on guard so that there is, even if the program ends, they will be kind of keeping an eye so that there is no relapse of doing things like before. I think we talked about the multidimensional, the ecological model. And finally, SASA can be accessed in our website. I can share in the chat box, but maybe what I could do is we really encourage organizations who are considering SASA for their programming or SASA Together Now. They explore ways of accessing technical assistance or technical support. Raising Voices provides technical support for a group of organizations, like what we call cohorts, and we even had a call for partnership a couple of weeks ago. But if we can't find a structure for you to engage, we have also accredited TA providers that can support you in your programming. So I will put an email address that you can contact Raising Voices with, and then we can see what can be done. But we felt like the technical assistance were really helpful in getting the up-to-date experience and knowledge of SASA and SASA Together.
Much for that elaborate response. We have under 3 minutes to the time that we agreed we would end this program, but just to share the 3 minutes between you and Shanaaz, I'm just going to ask quick questions and then you respond to the questions as well as give your concluding remarks. For Shanaaz, there is a question that says, since some of our cultures are anti-women, can it be advocated that our local law should no longer be based on some cultural norms and traditional practices? For instance, some cultures prohibit legally married women from inheriting dead husbands' properties. I'm just reading the questions the way they came, so I've not paraphrased. The second one is, where do violence against and by youth interventions fall in the VAC and VAW framework? That is for you. And then for Natsnet, the first question is, a number of programs require buy-in from community and from perpetrators of violence in urban settings. How do you get to perpetrators to bring the mindset change? And the second one is related to SASA. What do you think are components of SASA that are effecting change, and how can the change be maintained long term? I will just request the two of you to stick to 1.5 minutes to the responses. I know it's a very tough call, but let's try to stick to 1.5 minutes so we don't go overboard. Thank you so much, participants, for your questions. Yeah. Over to you, Shanaaz.
Stella, the time doesn't allow us to really give in-depth responses to yes. And so I'd rather want to suggest perhaps what we should be doing is people can email us and we can respond. And maybe just for us to give our closing remarks, because that leaves us with 1 minute each. So
All right.
I'm really wanting to
go ahead.
Yeah, so what I really want to leave participants with today is to say that it's really, really important for us to be investing in thinking about joint programming. It's going to take a lot of cooperation and trust, because as Stella articulated, you know, when you do joint programming, there is the issue of not trusting whether in fact it's going to be disproportionately affecting women and putting them on the back foot, or children, and therefore we have to start thinking about how we put those differences aside, because ultimately what you're wanting to do is to move the field forward, and the only way to reduce violence against women and children is to have programs that is effective to reduce both. So the challenge out there is to start working jointly and to think about collaborations more constructively.
Natsnet, 1 minute.
Well, actually, some of my points are already covered by Shanaaz. So yeah, I believe that we see a lot of opportunity to addressing this two issue in one intervention, but at the same time, it's not going to be an easy task. We really need to have a careful approach around keeping the balanced focus on these two issues, and then prevent harm in both children and women, because some experiences, like when the two issues get merged, so much of harm could really happen. So we need to really craft the PAVE with a lot of thinking, reflection, and then considering this do no harm for both women and children, and then maintaining the focus around feminist analysis, because we the knowledge that we know so far is the structure, the family structure, and the power, hierarchical power relations are the main drives of both violence against women and violence against children. So we should really keep our main focus on the structural elements.
Thank you so much to both of you. Thank you for giving us this exposure and even leaving us with questions for reflections. On my part, I take one thing, that there's need, if we are to shift, then we need to have to unlearn, learn, and then relearn. And we're still a long way from doing that. The evidence is there, the programs are working. We need to see how we can adapt and bring them up to scale. But the question still remains that the challenges of forging joint programming are children could be swept under the carpet. Women could lose in the process. So where do we draw the line? How do we do the balancing act? And I think that is a question that we need to look at as we think about joint programming. These challenges need to be discussed. We have just started the conversation. We started it on the 15th. We are moving through 15th of September. We are moving through to the 13th of October. But I just want to draw the attention of the participants that on the 6th of October, we have an interesting engagement, that we are moving away from the continent and from sharing experiences from elsewhere. And we are narrowing down into South Africa. What is working? South African national policy frameworks, do they support integrated approach? Now, this is not to alienate those of us who are not from South Africa, but this is also an opportunity for us to learn. What is it that is working in South Africa that we can adopt and learn? Remember, the role of the Africa Partnership is to promote cross-country and cross-continent learning, and therefore this is an opportunity for all of us to learn. We want to thank our co-conveners, but above all, thank Raising Voices for being part of this segment with us. We thank you so much. Our appreciation to Napak, tell him my greetings. The Institute, the Children's Institute in the University of Cape Town, Shanaaz, thank you to your team and the team behind the scene for putting this together. South African Medical Council, Research Council, sorry, South African Medical Research Council, thank you so very much for being part of this. Sonke Gender Justice, thank you so much for being a part of this. And the team from the Africa Partnership to End Violence Against Children, I know they're still listening in. Thank you so very much. And from me to all of you, have a nice evening. Thank you.
Thank you.